Test. Thanks, man.
So thank everyone for being here. This is the first time I've done a talk like this, so
Oh, yeah?
yeah.
I love the scarf.
Thanks. Um, so Michael Gibson is the co-founder of VC firm 1517, which is devoted to backing dropouts and people who have never stepped foot on a college campus. He's also a co-founder of the Theil Fellowship and worked with renowned investor Peter Thiel. And previously, before that, he was working towards a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Oxford and has also written on innovation technology for journals such as MIT's Technology Review, National Review, and The Atlantic. So thank you for being here.
Great.
To start off,
Well, say a little bit about yourself.
Oh. So my name is George. I'm a graduate of UMD back in 2018, and also startup alumni. And I currently run a company called Hydrus.ai, and we help companies manage their industrial data so that they have a better understanding of their operations. And we are also a portfolio company of 1517.
One of the outliers. So maybe a little more info on 1517. We started the Theil Fellowship, which is a grant program founded by Peter Thiel, where in 2010, where we decided to give out $100,000 grants to 20 people a year. And it had two noteworthy conditions. Number one was that you had to be 19 and under when you applied. And number two was that you had to not be in school. So you couldn't be in college to receive the grant. You had to take time off or not go. And we did that for a couple reasons. But the first one was this broad idea that outside of telecommunications and computers, the rate of progress has slowed down since about 1971. In fact, there's a website I suggest everyone go look at called WTF Happened in 1971. And it's a storehouse of graphs related to a lot of the struggles we're facing as a nation, as a world. And a lot of it relates to the decline in the rate of innovation. So if you look at various sectors like energy, healthcare, education, we have not been making great progress for about 50 years. So we started this fellowship because we thought one of the ways to ratchet up the rate of progress again would be to get people out to the frontiers faster. And there were a lot of people back then, and I think it's also true now, that just thought the only path to success was to get a 4-year degree, that it was okay to accumulate student debt. And what we saw was a lot of people taking safe but well-paying jobs in order to service that debt. So it'd be management consulting, maybe investment banking, maybe working for a big tech company. So we thought, okay, let's get them before the machine does and give them 100K, pursue their passion project. So we ran that program for 5 years. We saw a lot of cool stuff come out of it. Probably the most notable is we helped Vitalik Buterin launch Ethereum in 2013. He was just a wiry Russian guy from Waterloo, Canada when we met him, and saw that lift off. Another recent example that gained some press was Dylan Field. We helped him launch a company called Figma in 2012, and that was bought last year by Adobe for $20 billion. So we saw a lot of great stuff coming out of this program, even by 2015. My co-founder, Danielle Strackman, she was part of that fellowship team. We're like, wow, investments, this doesn't have to be a nonprofit. So we spun out and started our fund. And it's called 1517 because that was a geeky historical analogy to the Protestant Reformation. So it's the year Martin Luther nailed his theses to a church door. And what Martin Luther was protesting against was the sale of a piece of paper. The church was selling something called an indulgence. If you paid money for this piece of paper, you were absolved of your sin. You could pay for your family's sins to be absolved. You could commit sins, keep paying, and the church told you this is okay because you're forking over cash. And they built these magnificent palaces like St. Peter's Basilica with this money. So Martin Luther was pissed off about that, 95 Theses. So we thought that there is a church today that you are all in, that I am in with you today, called the college or the university, and it issues a piece of paper that you're told you'll go to hell without. It's called the diploma. Ever since the 1970s, that college wage premium has grown some and then stagnated. But the general idea is that nowadays, at least in 2010, it was certainly true, less so now, but the prevailing cultural norm was that everyone had to go to college. And we see the fellowship and our fund as a alternative education, an institution that stands outside that. We want to help support and validate people who want to take a different route or try something new faster rather than, some ideas can't wait. So that's general background. Sorry to jump ahead, but I thought maybe it'd be good to lay that groundwork.
So for the 95 Theses, and I hear that you have 95 issues that you have with the higher education system. How did you go about coming up with that? What was it like?
Okay, I did write, so 15, 17. In 2017, that would mark the quincentennial. I think that's the right word. 500th anniversary of this event. It's somewhat apocryphal that he actually nailed the theses to the door. Some people dispute that. But nevertheless, one of the interesting things about the story was that the printing press had been around for about 50 years, and it really came into its own in Luther's time. So his was like the first listicle to go viral. And he was a bit of a shit poster, too. He was known to use vulgarity when the church really didn't like that and that kind of thing. So in 2017, we had an event. We got people together to celebrate the 500th anniversary. And I locked myself into a cabin and wrote a new 95. You can search for it. But yeah, I had been collecting different thoughts about college and how it influences our culture, how it warps character, how some of the criticisms of it, and yeah, you can go through all 95 if you like, but yeah, we put it out there, and then we printed them on scrolls. And it was wild. We had about 20 of them, and people didn't nail them, but taped them to like their college administrators' doors or up on famous monuments. Like at Harvard, there's this John Harvard statue, and someone pasted the 95 Theses to the John Harvard statue that day. That was pretty cool.
Do you have any other stories of any sort of trouble that you've had on the campuses?
Yeah, so over the years, so we started this fellowship program, and it was a bit of a controversy right away. I remember this reporter, Jacob Weisberg at Newsweek, decided in the week after the Theil Fellowship was announced in 2010, he wrote an article in which he started, I don't know, he made it sound like we were trying to lure people away to money and greed, that we were creating some version of the white man's NBA. It didn't make sense, but that was the start of the criticism. The best over the years, though, was probably the former president of Harvard and former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers said of our program that it was, quote, the most misdirected philanthropy of the decade. And I really took that as a badge of honor. Larry Summers is crazy, so maybe that's a good thing. But over the years, various colleges did take issue with us. Most prominently was MIT. They had a hackathon in, I think, 2013. And the head of the entrepreneurship center there, Bill Allett, did not. He learned that we were there, offering out grants to people. We were given, hackathon prizes and stuff. And he didn't like that. He took to the Boston Globe. He derided us there, and then he banned us from MIT. So yeah, theoretically, I'm still banned from MIT.
So given everything that has happened over the last decade within education, do you think the value of education is going to go down over time? Do you think they're ever going to kind of go away entirely, fall to the ground entirely? And religion is still here, after millennia. So
right.
Will education, do you think it will stand the test of time?
College is a scam. No, I'm not. I don't go that far. I think it's important to know why you're going to college. There is a common misperception. It's basically the consensus that says you go to college to learn skills, and then those skills are rewarded later on in life. But when you look at the economic research on this and the psychological research on this, it's not there. It can't be supported. So, there's a great book out there called The Case Against Education by the economist Brian Kaplan. It's a very good survey of some of these issues. But basically, there are two models of education. One is the human capital theory, which is that story about acquiring skills. Human capital means you're acquiring the ability to do things. And the other story is called the signaling model. And so there are different ways of looking at this. There are a couple of things that the human capital story doesn't take into account. The first, probably most prominent problem with the theory is just what's called ability bias, which means universities are picking and filtering for really smart, talented people. So imagine school as a box, and the input is the person at 18, and the output is at 22. Well, they don't really account for the ability of the person coming in when they look at the college wage premium. So you can control for that in some ways, but not totally. The next issue is that there's something called the sheepskin effect. So this is on the human capital model. You would predict that for every year of education that someone has, they would be gaining more skills, and therefore, with each additional year, they would be making more money. But that's not what you see in the data. You see some growth in earnings per year, but a big chunk comes in that last year when you graduate. So you could imagine if you had every credit but one, and you were on your way to your final exam, you get hit by a car, you can't make the exam, and your professor is like this really strict guy who won't cut you any slack, and you don't get that credit, you're one credit shy of graduating, you decide to just enter the labor force, your wages are going to be 30% less than someone who took that exam and got a C. So that doesn't make sense. You should be paid about if you have 99 out of 100 credits, you should be paid 99% of those wages. So something's off there with the human capital model. And so the signaling model says, actually what's going on is there's a labor market and employers have a tough time sorting through potential employees. So they want to figure out a way to quickly identify people who can do the job, who can be relied upon to do the job for many years and do it well, and they won't have trouble with and won't have to fire, because it's hard to fire people. To do that, they have chosen to use the college degree. So what it does is it helps people signal not only that they have the intelligence to do the coursework, but that they have the commitment to see through a 4-year project, come to class on time, get assignments done, take exams. That's a very special type of person, but it has nothing to do with the skills that someone learned. So that's the broad economic case. Now, I mentioned when it comes to the ability bias, how do you run a control? Well, you need to find the types of people who have the ability to go to college, but choose not to, and instead do something else. And then you could compare those two groups, because one received the treatment and one didn't. And we did that with the Theil Fellowship. And by God, people, not everyone built Ethereum, but all of those people, a few went back to college, but the vast majority did not. And those that didn't are, making good salaries and so on. I don't know the numbers, but I think it's way above the typical college graduate. So yeah, I think as the cost of college goes up, 1.7 trillion in student debt, I don't need to tell you that you really need to think hard about why you guys are here. You can't just come here and explore things aimlessly and then not think about how you're going to make a living just because the cost is so high these days.
And I think a lot of the schools know how to discriminate when it comes to the cost of tuition.
Yeah.
Here they have differential tuition. So if you have a degree in engineering, computer science, or from the business school, you're paying more every semester.
Oh wow.
So
Yeah, even the top schools will do that too, but something like 40% of the student body pays the full sticker price, which is quite extraordinary. I think the state schools are underrated. If it's not like the Ivy League is better at teaching things than other schools, and so I don't know about UMD, but I imagine there's some kind of in-state residency and all that kind of stuff. Which, okay, if you're going to go through the system, then that's the cost-effective way to do it.
you have a very interesting background for being in the venture capital space, in that a lot of other people have a traditional finance background. You know, they might just be really people who know numbers, and you have a completely different background from that. So, and so does Danielle. So I was wondering if you can share a bit about how you got to venture capital, and what your prior life was like. For that.
Yeah, I have no business being in venture capital, and neither does my co-founder, Danielle. Most people who work in venture capital, as George mentioned, have a background in finance. I mean, there are a few ways you can have a career in venture capital. Now, the industry really started in Silicon Valley in the 1970s. It's a good historical question why that was the case. It has to do with a little bit with the law that was changed to allow certain types of investors to invest in those types of funds, but it was also the rise of semiconductors and then eventually personal computing. And so it is still the case that a lot of the top funds in the industry are from that era. And some of, a lot of the founding partners are now retired, but there's still people who were young then who are still there now. So I'd like to say, okay, how do you get a job in VC in Silicon Valley? Well, you were there in the 70s and you're still there now, or the early 80s. So it's not it's not a very dynamic industry. Part of the reason why is that there's this bandwagon effect where if you are one of the earlier winners as a fund because you invested in Apple, then companies that are out there raising money have an additional reason to work with you because they want to advertise to the media, to future employees and other investors that they're the next Apple. So they're, Sequoia Capital is the Yankees of Silicon Valley. They invested in Apple, and now to this day, companies really want to work with them. Because they want that fairy dust. So that it makes it really hard to break into the industry because those old funds have such a strong advantage. So maybe you got a job there because you worked at Sequoia long ago. Or second way to get in the venture capital is to be an operator or founder, have an exit. So, you built a company from nothing to something. The company goes public. You decide after 10 years you're done running a company. Now you want to sit on the other side of the table and you become an investor. A lot of great investors fit that category. Most prominently, probably Reid Hoffman, if you've heard of him. He's at Great Lot Capital. He's the founder of LinkedIn. Peter Thiel, my former boss, part of the PayPal mafia, and first outside investor in Facebook. So that's how you get a job in venture capital. And then the last would be, okay, you're just, you were on the path. I heard it referred to as the path once, which is you go to college, you get a job at Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, maybe a hedge fund, you go to business school and then, or law school or something. And there are a few of those people. Okay, so I have no business being in this business. I don't fit any of those three paths. I thought I was going to be a philosophy professor. I dropped out of that program. Danielle, my co-founder, started a charter school in San Diego, K through 8, has about 400 students. And so I wrote a book about this called Paper Belt on Fire. I thought it was an interesting business story because here are two people with no background in finance, none of those paths open to them, but they started this program with Peter Thiel. We launched a fund, and we're pretty successful for an early fund. We had a company go public in 2020 called Luminar Technologies that made our investors over $200 million on $17 million invested. So quite extraordinary business story. So I wrote a book about it. Check it out. I think it's a pretty good story. It's some color on how I left philosophy to become an investor. But I think, on the other hand, that we only are successful as a fund because of who we are, because we have this background. It's only the case that I might question the current social system or prevalent institution in it, and then decide that it's an investment thesis. I mean, maybe that is grounded in my philosophy. I'm not quite sure. But with Danielle, she certainly has been a lifelong revolutionary in education, visionary. She started her charter school because she wanted to do something different. She was part of the homeschooling community for a long time. So we really do see the fund as an expression of these deeper values.
Within your book, Paper Belt on Fire, there's a lot that you talk about, the different founders you've worked with, the different companies. You've mentioned Loom, Luminar, and a variety of others. How do you identify promising individuals and ideas to support? What do you look for?
Yeah, great question. So anytime you talk to an investor, they're going to use three elements to evaluate your company. The first element is going to be the team. The second element is going to be the potential market size. And the last element will be the current state of the product. And that's in the order of priority that we give them. Different investors have different emphasis. I mentioned Sequoia when they invested in Apple. That was led by Don Valentine, and he was notorious for just always zeroing in on that market opportunity. Maybe Peter Thiel, genius that he has 26 dimensions that he considers parameters. I don't know. But for us, because we ran that fellowship for so long and people were just getting started, and because we're pre-seed investors and anything goes, we really do have to focus on the team, which I'll get to in a second. But the market size is really what drives the VC business model. It's very much like Hollywood, where a studio releases a movie and it's got to be a big blockbuster to make up for all the duds that they put out. So a venture fund, people raise money, they invest it across a portfolio of 40 companies, let's say, and then there's a power law distribution in the returns. Something like 35 of those companies will go bust. Another 2 or 3 might make a little bit of money, but the one company usually, sometimes 2, will drive the returns. Now, what kind of returns? If you're an investor out there with lots of money, you can put your money in public stock. You can put it in bonds. You can put it in real estate. You can do lots of things with your money. Why would you invest in venture capital? Your money's locked up for 10 years. It's very risky. You've heard most startups fail. Most VC funds fail. Something like 80% of all VCs don't make it. So in order to stay in the game, you have to make more than 3 times the money that you have, that your investors invest in you, and you have to return that in 7 to 10 years. So if you have a $20 million fund as a VC, you got to make $80 million, $60, $80 million over that time in order to stay in business. So when you talk to a VC, they're really going to think in those terms. They're going to think, okay, are you the one company that if I invest in you, I'm going to make that kind of return? And if you're just starting out, as most of you are, typical pre-seed investors might try to, let's say they try to get 5% ownership in your company. If they're a $20 million fund and they have 5% of your company and you're the company that has to bring the fund back, just to break even, you have to be a $400 million company. That's huge. But then to bring home 60 million, 80 million, now you have to be something like a billion plus, right? So that's why maybe there's this term you've heard, VC scalable. That refers to this idea that the company's growth has to be so extraordinary that the market cap is higher, is in that $1 billion range. And then to get a market cap at that height, it's always valuations are always based on revenue, and there are all these different pricing models, and every industry is different, but it's some multiple on the revenue, right? So that's why VCs think the way they do. just as like a tip, like when you're pitching people, that's you got to keep that in mind because it could be the case that you have a great business. I've never started a business that makes $10 million a year. That is amazing. Anyone who does that is in the Hall of Fame. But sadly, it's not a great investment for a venture capital fund. So you might get no's because people can't seem to find that plausible story about how you're going to grow. Now, to come back to the question, is like, okay, so we invest so early, though. There's like, I just mentioned revenue and multiples and all this stuff is like, how can you possibly judge that? Well, we gotta evaluate the character of the people. And we learned a lot about this when we ran the Theil Fellowship. When that started, we had an application that was like a college application. We asked for test scores, GPA, what school you went to. In the first year, we quickly learned that this was not a great predictor of success. It did not matter where you went to school. And some things were negative. We came to see there was one thing, there was the Intel Science Award. I don't know if anyone won it here, but there was something about people who won that they turned out to be quite brittle when they entered the real world, especially when they tried to turn that idea into a company, because I think pleasing committees that are looking for virtue signals is not the same thing as creating something valuable that people want and need. So I think there were a lot of pie in the sky projects that wouldn't get off the ground. But what we did see that mattered were things that were tough to capture in an application. I came to see an application as like fruit. It starts off fresh and gets rotten fast because information would change. You know, you're working on a startup, 1-2 months pass, maybe you pivoted, maybe you're doing something new. So that's why we really have to focus on the character of the people, because we have to know that they're capable of doing that. If you're building something technical, you need to have you got to have the technical chops to do it, for sure. But there were other characteristics that we came to see as being very important. One is just a bias to action, bias to execute. And if we know someone over time, because maybe we gave out a 1K grant, they started working on something, they executed on that, maybe it didn't work. It's like we noticed there's this bias to action. Commitment is important to us. Why are you doing what you're doing? We meet people, like we saw that neither fame nor fortune can last as a motivation, because starting a company and seeing it through is a 5 to 10 year project, and in that time there are going to be exhilarating highs and despondent lows. There are dark nights of the soul, and if you're doing it for the money, that's not enough to pull you through. So it's got to be something deeper than that. It could be a mission, it could be your purpose, but it could also just be like sort of band of brothers type thing, like you love the people you're working with and it excites you to do fun things with them. So we're wondering, why are you doing this, and how committed are you? So the dropout thing is big, because if you're willing to leave school to work on something, you're willing to go away from this socially sanctioned path to do this unusual project. That's a big leap, and that tells us a lot about how committed you are to something. So in my book, I go through some of these characteristics. In some cases, we just had to make up names for them because I couldn't find any parallels in the psychology literature. But I think a lot of it is related to what you can't. It's hard to teach these things. Like, courage is obviously needed, and I'm not quite sure what an education in courage would look like. It's so hard to know how to embolden people to do things, and it's not just the courage. Like, a lot of the rhetoric around entrepreneurship is like, just jump, just do it, just it's like extreme sports, like jump out of a plane or paraglide off a cliff, and maybe like the first hour is like that, but it's going to be a grind. You need that sustaining motivation, and that requires a certain type of courage. So I did realize this kind of thing is probably more like sports recruiting. I talked to an NBA scout, and if you think of all the money spent on identifying talent in professional sports, and all the amount of time and effort, it's extraordinary how little they know when looking for predictive characteristics in people. I mean, think of Tom Brady. I forget, he was drafted way down in the draft. So the same thing. I think anyone anywhere can become a great entrepreneur. We have some ideas about some of those characteristics that contribute to success, but nothing guarantees success. It's just there's a lot that, you need a lot of luck, a lot of timing, but also just like anything can happen. So yeah, I do my best in the book to go through those things.
It's very well put. Really interesting about 1517 is that you will invest in a variety of different types of companies. If you see the paradigm that we've seen with Silicon Valley, VC is over time a lot of investors will not want to invest anything but software. But you all have ventured outside of that, and with the deep tech focus. And I'm wondering if you can share a bit about that, because although there's a big focus on software, I think there's that whole argument about the world of bits and bytes versus atoms and molecules, like the physical world. It's way harder, but where if you have breakthroughs, you have almost way larger of an impact in a sense.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that stagnation story. The stagnation we've seen is not in bits, but in atoms. And we could debate about why that's the case. It could be that some of these endeavors were just forbidden outright. But it's also the case that maybe there's opportunity there where there wasn't before to do new things. I mentioned Luminar. They make a perception stack for cars, driver assist and driverless cars. Their number one customer is Volvo. That involved creating a LiDAR system from scratch, lasers, chips, so on. So it is impressive what people can do when they have a technological competitive advantage. I think that is quite powerful. But it is extremely difficult. We had success with Luminar, a company that we backed. We were the first investors in a company called Lambda. They make the on-premises workstations for deep learning. They're doing more in the cloud. That, again, came down to us trusting the team. They started, they were always experts in neural nets, going back to the early 2010 or so. But, when I can't remember. I think it must have been 2015. They made a photo sharing app at that time where it was one of these early things where you take your photo and then you run it through the algorithms, and then you get to see your photo as if Picasso drew it or Van Gogh. And they were one of the first people to do that, one of the first teams to do this. And they had something like 180,000 app users. And they were doing really well, but then all the copycats came, and this Russian company put out something, I think it was called Prism, ended up, destroying Lambda in terms of that competition. And these guys were so down, the founders. We meet with our companies once every couple months to catch up, and I think we had 2 or 3 of those meetings in a row where growth was they were shrinking in terms of their users. The morale was low, totally demoralized. And then we showed up one day, and and they had all this bubble wrap and packaging around, and they had one of the towers, and we're like, did you become a computer company? And they're like, yeah. Like, what? They're like, oh, yeah, because to do the compute for the app, they had created their own workstations. And they decided in a cost-saving measure they were going to sell a few on Amazon. So they just pretended to be a company, and they sold one, I think, for $10,000 to someone in Cupertino. So they drove it over. And all of a sudden they're like, wow, we could start selling these workstations. So they started making workstations, and their revenue grew pretty fast. And for the first, I mean, they make workstations, they make data centers, they make laptops, all for deep learning. And do you have one here? Amazing. Now with that business, what was interesting, even though they're at $100 million in revenue on that business, on selling their hardware, but back to the Wall Street analyst point of view, when you're valuing a company, not all revenue is created equal. And the best business in the eyes of a Wall Street analyst in terms of the value of the revenue is one in which it costs nothing to produce the next unit. So think of Facebook or Instagram, let's say, it's like it costs them nothing to create a new account for someone, right? Or a new Facebook page, whatever. So the marginal cost is zero. The margins are enormous on the business, and the revenue is pretty reliable. So those companies, they get these huge multiples on their valuations. Now with Lambda, because people are buying these things one off, I think their margins at the time, let's say, I don't know what they are now, but it was something like 40% margins. It's like they could only get a 2x multiple on their revenue. So even though they had 100 million coming in, they're a $200 million business. But they launched their cloud product. That's taken off like a rocket. And so, yeah, I just see bright future for that company. Now, to go back to your point, it's like, wow, we didn't know that they'd become a hardware company. We just really believed in the team, and that's what it comes down to. Back to is like, okay, we are willing to take these risks because I think, the best founders. Okay, to go to the philosophy and literature. I studied ancient philosophy. I know ancient Greek and Latin, and some of my favorite things in language are untranslatable words. And there's this famous, in the first line of the Odyssey, there's a word that is famously untranslatable. It's like, all these great poets have taken their cut at it. And the poem begins, it's like, sing to me, muse, about this man. And then there's this word that describes the man. It's polytropon. And a literal translation, we get poly like polyscience or polygamy, right? It means many. Polygon, and then tropos is we get the word trope from that, which is like a way of doing something. But in Greek, it also meant a road, a path. And so Odysseus is the many-wayed man. That's a bad translation. Sometimes people say, oh, the cunning, the resourceful. But my own personal translation is something like tricky bastard, because it has a little bit of a negative tinge to it that I think most translators don't appreciate, because the only other person in all of Greek who is attributed with this adjective is Hermes once. So I think all great founders have a little bit of a tricky bastard in them, where they're capable. It's all that word is meant to describe not only the twists and turns of Odysseus's journey, but also the twists and turns of his mind that enabled him to find his way home. I think it's true of all great founders that they just find a way. That's like, it's incredible sometimes. And like that Lambda story is like, oh my God, they just found a way. And that's what we're looking for in founders. And even if they convince us that the hardware is going to have that technological competitive advantage, then I think it's worth backing. Not all VCs will do it because they're worried about those margins, and they're worried about the timeline. Often takes the years to get hardware out there reliably. Is just really it's a longer time frame than a software company that can move fast.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few ideas that are just going to take maybe 20 years. It's going to take way longer.
Yeah.
And as a VC fund, a lot of them out there maybe have like a 7-year return schedule. So there's just not enough time. Their LPs are pushing them, saying we need return, and they're like, well, like science just takes time. These innovation discovery.
And our our regulatory system is not made for it. The SEC has a rule that I forget the numbers at this point, but you have to go public once you hit a certain number of investors. I forget what that is. Could be 200, could be 300. I'm not sure. So that if you're private for 15 years, it gets more and more difficult to maintain or to comply with that regulation. Look at SpaceX. I guess they've been private for, could be close to 20 years at this point. And it'd be interesting to know how they do it. But I think Musk has had to, tell a compelling story about where the company's going. And I don't think, the pitch wasn't Starlink. It was, we're getting to Mars. So it's a really unique story. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard to stay private for that long.
Talking about all these different industries, you were just talking about space for a second. You've mentioned, Luminar, and of course, if we look the past 10 years, 10, 15 years, there's been a variety of different technologies, of different software platforms, social media, so on and so forth. what interests you over the present and kind of what you're seeing? There's things like Chat GPT and all this other stuff. So I'm curious to see, like what have you been seeing so far?
We see a lot across the board. One of my favorite recent investments is everyone thinks the future in space, in terms of moving things around, is going to involve rockets. But we got pitched by these guys who want to build catapults in space. So we're actually going backwards. But of course, it requires some ingenious engineering. Their first goal is to get so they have a catapult it'll be on a satellite, and it can whirl a object around the Earth into orbit, and then it'll catch it. Well, I mean, it'll be going the same speed and then manage to sweep it in. And the reason you want that is there's a dual purpose use in that first one, where our government wants to have objects that can't be detected in circling the Earth, and if there's no propulsion system, then there's no flare to detect it. But if you get these things in orbits in concentric circles, you could do it where one throws an object to the next one higher up, and so on all the way out. And then when you're on the moon with 1/6 of the gravity, why send things across the ground? Maybe you should just throw them. So I don't know. Long story. Just an example of something that really excited me because it was so weird. But I do think space is opening up thanks to SpaceX. The cost of sending things up into orbit has declined dramatically, which means people can get their first satellite up to run experiments to try an idea out. So we're starting to see more of that. I think with Starship that'll continue to decline. That's very exciting. All the things that have stagnated since the 1970s, I'm excited about. So that could be in healthcare. We could just go through the list of I mean, when you think of all the ways the human body can go wrong, it's a chamber of horrors, and it freaks me out. But there are major diseases that are still killing people: heart disease, different forms of brain degeneration, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, so on. Things related to mental health. I mean, it's fascinating to me that we still don't know the causes of these things. That the limits of our knowledge prevent us from knowing the causes of these diseases. Schizophrenia, we don't know what causes that. The science of psychology still relies upon the same diagnostic framework that it's been using for like 200 years, which is just pattern recognition. So it's like a lot of these diseases are talked about as if they're well-defined concepts with hard edges, but we don't know the biological underpinnings of them, or there's no brain signature for them. It's just like, oh, you have this, really? Well, it could be this or whatever. So that blows my mind. Transportation. I think the Concorde was retired in the early 2000s. We are now moving slower than we were in 1972 when you take into account the time it takes to get to the airport and get through TSA and so on. Energy creation. Love looking at nuclear fusion. Love, if you can solve in solar and wind, if you can solve the intermittency problem, that would be a miracle. So we could go through these one by one. Weird ones are like fresh water creation. I live in the American West. The aquifers and reservoirs and rivers are drying up. I'd love to see new forms of desalination, new forms of seeding the clouds so that they rain more. I think there's lots of exciting things we can do to solve these problems. Oh, but with software, okay, I think the Chat GPT stuff is exciting. I'm not a doomer. I don't think that the Skynet is around the corner. I don't know what you all think. But it is pretty wild how far it has come in the last year. And I don't know. It's like one guy told me he's prepared for the singularity, and that humanity is going to end. And I suppose it is a scary world if any of us can query Chat GPT and say, oh, can you make me 3 diseases that are more infectious than Ebola and deadlier, and send them out to the world. And ChatGPT is like, sure, I'll do this for you, whatever. So as soon as that's possible, I guess that's a brave new world. On the other hand, if we all have access to the greatest teacher of all time, all the time, maybe that just changes education in ways we can't predict. Why would I take a Spanish class when I just have a Spanish tutor at all times who can speak fluently, hear every word I say, correct my pronunciations, test me, all this stuff at home for free in my pocket? That's like, what? I don't know what happens then. Maybe schools become more like social clubs than they are now. And that could be exciting. I've always discounted that stuff because it just has been oversold all the time. And then we get trapped in these debates about the end of times. So I personally, I think I've just had assumptions that I've been committed to that prevented me from seeing how fast this pace of change has been.
You mentioned the American West.
Yeah.
So I'm going to touch on that. So in this crowd, we have a lot of technologists, software engineers, mechanical, a variety of different types of engineers, and they're often looking at careers out in Silicon Valley, out in the Bay Area, San Francisco. And in Paper Belt and Fire, I remember your criticisms and your concerns for San Francisco. And you and I, we've had chats about this, and I lived there for a few years, and you lived there for way longer, so I think your heart is more broken than mine is. But just want to hear when it comes to companies, innovation. Do you think it's still there? Do you think it's gone everywhere?
It's not totally dead in the old Silicon Valley, so Palo Alto, Cupertino, Mountain View. I think there's still a lot of people building the future there. I think the lone holdout in San Francisco, the city itself, is OpenAI, where a lot of talented people working there. But I don't know if you've seen the stories, but I lived in San Francisco from 2010 to 2020, and I saw the city just degenerate and decline over that time. Just an appalling humanitarian crisis in the streets, rents no one could pay. It was this strange concoction that I didn't know how it's possible. Like an appalling humanitarian crisis, luxurious rent prices, and then boring culture. So it's like all the high rent had pushed out all the poets, artists, mystics, hippies, and so on. It was just full of people, tech workers, and because you can't have a garage band if the garage costs $1 million. And then there's this weird. They had a poop patrol. It's like there was so much people were shitting on the streets, and the city had to create a band of people who wore hazmat suits and appeared on the sidewalks in the morning to spray away the poop. It's like, okay, when COVID hit, the city died. I don't know if it's coming back anytime soon because a lot of these problems haven't been fixed. The housing is so expensive because they have a law that bans anyone from building new housing. It's pretty stupid. So it's like over that 10 years I was there, you had more people come into town. They brought more money. The tech industry was making more money, but there was constrained supply. That's simple economics. And this killed the city, which is very sad to me. But on the other hand, I think it's also true that many other cities aren't great places or aren't what they used to be. And so I don't know, you look across history, and we praise creative individuals a lot, and I think they do deserve their praise. Leonardo da Vinci, and so on. But what's interesting is like these people tend to be part of scenes. They tend to be part of clusters. So it's not only when innovation happens or who's innovative, but like where it happens. And it seems to have a birth, a growth, a peak, and a decline. And these things are very precious in human history. The Renaissance, on a smaller scale, it could be like Paris in the 20s with painting and poetry. But these things don't last forever. So I hate to see us kill it for no reason. It's like San Francisco could have been this city of ambition that summoned anyone of any talent from around the world to contribute to the future. And instead, it's like this dystopian zombie wasteland. and that, yeah, that's very sad. So where's the future being built? I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe it's nowhere, but or maybe it's just spread out. It seems to be just spread out. So when you all are thinking about where you want to be, don't think you have to be in Silicon Valley. That's just not true anymore. You can build a company anywhere. So do it somewhere you love.
When I first found you all, found 1517, and it was kind of funny because I had first met Danielle, and you were in the you were in the corner drinking a beer, kind of just thinking, and I was just like, I'm a little bit intimidated.
Oh no.
How have you sort of found the evolution of technology and innovation? Sort of, how does that reflect when it comes to your values, and sort of like what informs your views on that?
Yeah, it's hard to make judgments about how socially beneficial or harmful any technology will be. I tend to want to see things in terms of man's or humanity's greatest potential in how we might realize that. Steve Jobs had this line that he said the computer was a bicycle for the mind, and he'd reference this Scientific American article. I guess they looked at the various locomotion of different animals, and at the top as the most efficient mover was the condor, and somewhere far down the list was man. Just, we're not very efficient in our walking. We tend to waste a lot of energy. But then the article noted that if you gave someone a bicycle, then they were far more efficient than the condor. And so Jobs said he saw the personal computer as a bicycle for the mind. Now we can debate about whether that's the case, but I think the dream is important. I think technology is a tool and it can be used for good or bad, but I think we should compare it to what are our highest capacities, what are our most noble dreams and ideals, and how can whatever we're doing or using, how can that help us realize those potentials. So that's very broad and abstract when you're like, oh, but look at this drug, should we pass it, what's the cost benefit analysis? Okay, then that's going to get hard, because it's always hard to know what the consequences of things are going to be, but you do your best to make a judgment.
So in every journey, there's often a rough road, like you mentioned earlier. And also in your book, in Paper, Belt, and Fire, you talk about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the, what are some of the challenges or obstacles that you've faced as a venture capitalist, and how have you overcome them? What have you learned?
We had a lot going against us because of our backgrounds when we got started. It was hard to get investors to believe in us just because we were so different. I had to learn a lot. So startups raise money from venture capitalists and angel investors. I didn't know anything about, okay, who do they raise money from? So that was an education when we set out to raise the fund. And it was like this whole world of different entities that we came to learn about. Just so, and it stands to it makes sense. Okay, in the last century, there have been people who created incredible companies, and now those people and families have wealth, and they're looking for ways to invest it. So, for example, Coors, the Coors family is investors in our fund. It's wild to me that there's still this family that had the beer company, right? So maybe that's the beer I was drinking. I don't know. And then we're too small for this as a fund, but like a lot of funds are raising money from teachers' pensions or police pensions, university endowments, the really big funds that are like raising $1 billion, sovereign wealth funds. We were just a small fund. We were raising $20 million, which was a lot to me, but in the world of VC, that was quite small. So we pulled it off. We did it for our first fund, but we hit. You raise that money and we invested it across 3 years, and then you're not companies that are 3 years old aren't far along, and so we had to raise our next round of money, and that was a low point for us because it was too early for those companies to have any meaningful substantial gain. It was a grind. It took us over a year to raise our second fund. We got so many no's, so many people who told us we were crazy and that they'd never give us their money. One of our employees had to take to driving a Lyft. Danielle and I, our salaries were peanuts. We were making like 30,000 a year. So yeah, we really had to grind that out, and fortunately, time proved to be on our side, and we convinced enough people to stay in business. It's not, I'm not gonna, there are no tears in that story, but it was pretty hard over the years to live that way, and it ended up working out. So on the it's like on the business side, there's that, but then there's just the personal side, which is like, okay, you dedicate yourself to it's like, I got divorced. I didn't have time to spend with friends and family. I sacrificed a lot, and maybe this is just part of life, but it can take its toll.
I think a lot of people in this crowd similarly are maybe at a crossroads. So for me, I can share that I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, kind of landed in the corporate job. It was one of those jobs where I was literally like, I did not need a college degree for that. I'm like, they wanted a piece of paper, but I'm like, a high schooler could do this work.
Yeah.
And this corporate job, it's strange. Like they pay very well, but you're not really doing very much of anything, and it's almost just like to pass time. So sometimes you have this issue, and maybe others in this crowd have this where they're like, do I build the business? Do I take this risk? I have the family pressure to, get a job, because that's what, people are familiar with. Maybe that's what the parents are comfortable with. What sort of advice would you give to people who are in that sort of situation?
My warning is it may be useful to work someplace for some period of time while you figure out what you want to do, but if you don't want to be an entrepreneur, that's not bad. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it's the only way to go. I just think there's something within people that the adventure calls to them in some way. Something that gnaws at their inside, a splinter in their heart, such that they feel like if they lived a life of quiet desperation, they'd be filled with regret when they're in their 30s and 40s. Because they didn't take that chance. They didn't do what they truly loved doing or what their passion was. So there's that future regret that I think can throw a shadow over you. And I think it's good because one of the things you may not realize yet is what it's like to make a little bit of money. It's like if you're in college, the idea of making $50K sounds like a lot of money, but then you graduate, and if you all have skills in computer engineering, you might be making six figures pretty quick, and plus options, plus bonus. You're making 300, 400K. All of a sudden, you get golden handcuffs, they're called, because it's like now you're living in a good apartment. You drive a nice car. You've got a dog. You've got maybe a spouse. You've got a mortgage. I don't know, but these things add up, and it makes it harder to take that leap, to try something different. So my warning there is to be careful. I think, to that splinter in the heart that really chews in at you, I think it's hard to hear or feel it sometimes. I think there's this idea that we should think for ourselves, but maybe even more important is that we should feel and judge for ourselves. I think there's this influence of the world on us about how we should feel our lives are going or where they're going. And I don't have any great advice on this. The best sort of things I've heard is that, and they're almost like magical and mystical. It's like, when you're walking during the sunset and you think about what you want to do to your life with your life, what are the images you see? And it tends to come in images, or when you're listening to your favorite music and you're dancing unselfconsciously, like, what images come to your head about how the life you want to live. And those things are very quiet and fragile, and I think we don't cultivate that intuition as a society. So I don't know if it always works out if you follow those things. I think the adventure will be worth it. The education alone will, enable you to do other things if it doesn't work out. But sometimes it does, and it can be quite fun.
That's what I would add to this is that, and I talked to this with my co-founder Noah quite a bit. I'm like, I have learned so much just building a business, building a company, and doing everything, like a little bit of everything. Like, of course, things like accounting. It's like, oh, like I really don't want to do this. But over time, you're like, okay, I've done software engineering, I've done product design, I've done marketing and sales. I've done. It's like once you like do a little bit of everything, you're like, okay, I know how this whole thing kind of works now. And I think that is probably most valuable because we've, seen quite a few people within 15, 17 as well go on to do.
Well, yeah, the risk isn't as high as it might appear. Actually, it's like all the skills and traits you just mentioned, employers would die to pay for. So people, maybe the startup shuts down, but they command pretty high prices in the labor market just because the companies are so hungry for people who have some of those traits I listed: bias to execution, getting things done on time. I mean, and coming up with creative new ideas and so on. Yeah, just because your company didn't work out didn't mean you didn't learn how to do those things. And so therefore, the fork in the road isn't as risky as it appears. It's like, oh, take this path where I'm going to learn to do these things, and if I fall off it, okay, option B is I work at a big company and they pay me a lot of money. That's pretty, good safety net.
Yeah. Well, at this point, I don't have any other questions.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is there time for one or two from the crowd? Or?
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Okay, cool, yeah. Happy to take any questions on venture capital, the startup stuff. Okay, yeah, here. Yeah.
So you seem pretty familiar with what happened in 1971 and pre-irritated. So why not focus on fixing that
Yeah. Oh, you mentioned the money is because we went off the gold standard. I thought. Well, look, I think that's an issue. It's certainly part of the problem. So Nixon famously closed the gold window, taking the dollar off the last remnant of the gold standard, and ever since then we've been based on this fiat system of money, which is the full faith and credit of the United States. And yeah, a lot of the macroeconomic indicators since that time, the government has just had no constraint on its ability to print money or spend, and I think that can be a drag on economic growth. But I also think there are other things that happened. I mean, for one, look at something like nuclear energy. I think concerns about its safety were just so great that we just decided not to build anything new. Other countries did, like France, for instance, depends upon nuclear power for a lot of its energy, and it's one of the lowest carbon emitters in the world because of it. So it's not always it's not just the money, but I do think that's important. I did have hope, and I still do in Bitcoin and other alternatives, because I do think the fiat system is so corrupt, but that might be too deep a rabbit hole. Yeah, sure. Yeah, you right here. Sorry. Mm. 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 Yeah. Hmm. It's fascinating to compare when thinking about the rate of innovation. We can compare nations. So some nations are more creative than others. and then we can compare the same nation over time. So the UK, for instance, and we could take something like number of Nobel Prize winners produced. That has changed over time. So by that metric, the U.S. is still the most creative place. It's close with some, and it depends on what dimension. But some countries like Switzerland, for instance, have a great biotech sector and a lot of research. But when you look at the macroeconomic data in terms of the amount of education and increased productivity and so on, it's not that great. Very, very small correlation. It's true that countries that spend more on education tend to have higher rates of productivity, but the causation could be the other way. It could be the case that those countries are so wealthy that they choose to spend more on education. Now, when we're comparing the United States, which has been on the frontier since, let's say, the 1940s, the frontier of discovering new things that haven't existed before is a very difficult place to live. It's hard to discover new things. Whereas a different kind of growth would be catch-up growth, which would be, okay, we're taking what was invented elsewhere or best practices that were discovered, and we're applying them to places where they haven't spread yet. And when I look at countries like China and India, the vast majority of their growth up until the present has been catch-up growth. It has not been about inventing or discovering things. And so maybe one kind of education system is good for catch-up growth, but you need something else for that frontier. I tend to think you need a little crazy in your sauce. You need to do things differently. And I worry, I'm actually quite bearish on China because I think they are too stilted right now. I mean, I think, Xi in the last few years, whatever happened between Jack Ma and some of the other tech billionaires had to have a chilling effect on that entrepreneurial community. I'm enough of a market-oriented person to think you need trial and error to discover new things, and you have to, in order to have that trial, you have to have crazy people willing to do those things. And so if everyone is so scared that they can't do different things, well, then you're going to see less innovation. So that I think that will be a challenge in the years ahead. Now, when I think about education, I think our creativity is a mystery. There's not a lot of good research on it. We don't know how to identify it. We don't know how to cultivate it. We just know that some people tend to be better than others at output. So that could be songs like the Beatles. It could be scientific discoveries like Einstein. And our school system just doesn't do anything about it. And I don't think any school system does in the world. I'd love, if anyone has an answer to that, I'd love to see it. But I've done a pretty good survey of the psychology research on creativity, and it's so lame. It's like, it's two things. It's like they'll have some study that'll be like, oh, we interviewed people, how many different ideas for this brick can you come up with? And then we tracked that person over time, and this guy was a musician, that lady was a sculptor. It was like, okay, this is pretty silly. And then you just have observational studies where it's like, oh, we looked at the lives of great people, and what can we distill from their lives? But that leaves out, that's the winner's curse. It's like, okay, and this is the same true of VC, where we're looking for these traits, but you don't hear about the people who had those traits and disappeared. You only hear about the ones who had it and did something. So our understanding of creativity is quite limited, and I wish, in terms of the limits of our current knowledge, in education and creativity would be wonderful. And one last point on this that I'll hammer on is, a lot of universities, I don't know the University of Maryland, but if you go to the homepage of a lot of universities, especially the arts and science undergraduate school, they'll say what their mission is. And they'll say their mission is something like, we teach the next generation of leaders how to think, how to be critical thinkers and leaders of tomorrow. And there's no evidence that schools do this. In fact, there's a lot of evidence against it. So one form of creativity would be to learn one domain and then take and distill some lesson from that domain and apply it to a problem in another field. This is called, in the literature, this is called transfer of learning. And after 90 years, psychologists are like, we have no idea how to do this. So, schools want to say, oh, we don't teach you what to think. We're not going to fill your head with useless facts and boring material. We're going to teach you how to think. Well, that's false marketing, and someone should sue them because there's no evidence that they make a change in anyone's ability across time. So the flip side of that, though, is to say, okay, maybe there is some way to cultivate creativity. We just haven't discovered it yet. Sure.
So, great talk so far. I kind of really do want to see the reevaluation of the value of this university system. There is one capacity in which I think they do have a role, not a role, but they fill a niche that I don't think there's necessarily space for yet. That being, for example, suppose your passion is like chemistry, for example. You're not dealing with mercury in like a in like a lab space.
Yeah.
In like a lab space that you with thousands of dollars in safety equipment, for example, that you don't necessarily have. And the thing is that some of these particular advancements require so much in just establishment capital in order to be able to attack and aren't democratized in any way. So I was wondering what the solution is to that and breaking the university's grip on innovation.
Right. I think it is really valuable infrastructure in just in terms of lab space. I totally agree with that. We see fewer people in biotech just because the capital expense is so much to get going. So in that way, universities are very valuable. And then on top of that, you just have the know-how, the knowledge. I think even like there's this concept of tacit knowledge, which you hear a lot in respect to a craft. Or even your handedness. It's like what you learned how to write with one of your hands and your dominant hand, and you might be able to write a handbook on handwriting, but like the tacit knowledge is the difference between your right and left hand. It's like you have all the explicit knowledge about how to write, and you could tell someone how to write, but like your left hand still is terrible. So the same is true of, I think, conducting experiments and doing science. And by being part of a scene in a lab on a university campus, you're having the conversations, you're picking up on the jargon, you're picking up on the approach. And I think this is even true of theoretical physics. And I wish we honored those master-apprentice relationships more in education. It used to be the case that they were quite prominent. One of my all-time favorite teachers in the annals of great teachers is this guy, Ernest Rutherford, who is the father of nuclear physics. What stands out to me about Rutherford is that he had no fewer than 13 Nobel Prize winners as his students. He won a Nobel Prize too. And, that's astonishing to me. And nowadays, I can't think of a single professor who has shepherded that many students through. And the key was this master-apprentice relationship that he had in his lab. So I think all of that is important. The end around could be some universities are starting to let people rent their space and have a presence. We have a young man from Madison who found at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, he was able to rent some lab space there and conduct early experiments. He's cured type 2 diabetes in mice and rats. He's now moving on to a primate. But he's done it without a college degree, and he's done it by renting lab space. So I wish there was some way to allow access to that whole infrastructure without like the whole admissions, hey, you got to take these classes and all this stuff. I don't know what it would be, but I wish there was some way to democratize it. Yeah. Right. Right. We do. We do think in terms of a portfolio construction. We did, we'll do the math on how many investments are we going to make in this fund, and then it's not a constant balancing, but we do start to notice that maybe we're too overexposed in some industry or sector. So we can take wild risks on the catapult idea, but we also know that we do need to drive returns by balancing it out. About 30% of our portfolio happens to be in enterprise SaaS, which is kind of funny if you think we're about it, because we're investing in people who are maybe 20 to 25 and they don't have college degrees. Like, how do they possibly have some insight into the way businesses do things? But it's pretty wild. They do. Loom was mentioned. That's probably one of our top performing enterprise SaaS companies. And yeah, so I don't want to make it sound like we won't look at those things. We love just a good business, no matter what it is. Oh, sure, going around the horn here. Okay. Well, it's good to have a roadmap. So if it's a medical device, knowing precisely, okay, here's how we're going to get approval from the FDA. That has to be mapped out and figured into the roadmap. Now, the roadmap is different from, let's say, a software company that can be early to revenue. People could have revenue on day one with a software company. With a hard tech company, it could be years. So we need a map that has milestones, technical milestones that will unlock more money. In the early days, that can be forms of non-dilutive grants from respected bodies. So it could be the case that you get SBIR grant, NSF grant. That allows you to build more credibility as a company and unlock that further money without having to get revenue. And then it could just be the performance of the tech. So it could be, we have a satellite company that's aiming to replace GPS. They were able to get their first satellite into orbit and test all of its functions. That unlocked a huge, it was like, okay, that was a proof point because it took away some of the technical risk. It's like, okay, we can do this. And that unlocked the next round of financing. So we need some plausible story about, okay, if we know you're not going to get revenue until year 4 or 5, what are the ways that you're going to be able to raise money on a year to 18-month cadence until then? What milestones can you hit with this budget? And sometimes they can't make it, but sometimes they can. But it just has to be plotted out, and that can be convincing to us. And those proof points really help if you can build credibility. The last thing is just the last Hail Mary is the letter of intent. So with every step of the way with these hardware things, it's like if you can get the future customer to say that they will buy this the day it is available and sign this piece of paper, that can be a validation point too. So you're looking for those things, yep. All the way in the back. Yeah. Yep. I always say who over what. So I think I'll use the Vitalik Buterin example. In 2012, he applied to the Theil Fellowship, and his idea was some ed tech idea. He was clearly accomplished, but it just has not been helpful in improving, people's learning. And we were skeptical then. We didn't award him a fellowship, but we kept in touch with him. When I was writing my book, I did some research and just going through old emails and dates and stuff, and it was wild to me. It's like, well, yeah, I had lunch with him 5 days after he wrote the Ethereum white paper in November of 2013. Or was that 2012? I think that was 2012, actually, yeah. So at that time, I knew what Bitcoin was. I was kind of intrigued by it, but I didn't really understand the underlying technology. I knew what a blockchain was in theory, but I didn't know its potential. And then I had lunch with Vitalik, and he started talking about how this underlying technology for Bitcoin could be repurposed for other things like digital contracts, digital assets, and I didn't know anything about that. So I had to do my homework, and then I researched it further, talked to him some more, and so on. So the moral of the story for me has always been, if I see a trend in the newspapers, some breaking story about a tech like ChatGPT or whatever, I know I'm too late. I know that if I try to fight to become part of that trend, there's already someone winning it. Is like with the Vitalik example, is like I found a person. That person brought me to the frontier in a field, and then they educated me on it. I had to get up to speed on it. And so I always try to stick by that as a rule of thumb when it comes to the frontier tech. So if something, and then things could just get too hot and too crowded, and we're just like, okay, we're not going to try to pick a horse in this race. It's just not for us. So in that sense, well, it's like patting ourselves on the back, but I think it's really important to do your own homework and to think for yourself. It's like venture capitalists are herd animals. It's like they wait until someone makes an investment and then they all want to pile on. It's that same signal I talked about earlier. Sequoia came in, now we want in. It's like we got trapped in that once in our first fund. We didn't have time to do our proper research, and we had to make a decision. We're like, we can't do this. We decided, it's like we have to trust our process. We have to think for ourselves, and we passed on the deal. In that way, we're going to live or die by that. Maybe we die, but I just think it's important that we can't get caught up in trying to chase something. And I think that the best investments we've made have been in people who took me to the frontier. So that's why I'm here tonight. It's like I'm here to meet you all. I met some people earlier over office hours. It's like I already got an education in some things. It's like I'm always trying to meet people and hear the new song, hear the new sound. I'm like that record producer in the bars and clubs. It's like it's going to come from a garage. It's not going to come from the studio in LA.
First of all, thank you for the talk. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with David Levinstein's book, How to Invest. But in that book, he mentions that his biggest regret is missing out on opportunities, like investment opportunities that could have provided a very big massive return. So, and I know in the venture capital space, the name of the game is investing into as many potential startups as you
Yeah.
can, and you'll hit that one unicorn opportunity, which is going to drive the return of the fund. So how do you, as a venture capital investor, get over your bad days? Like, do you like sometimes reflect on them?
Yeah. It's not too hard to get over the investments that don't work out. That's just part of the game. And we tell our companies that on day one, is that we have zero expectations because we know this is the way it works. That power law I talked about. It's like, oh my God, wow, this is going to be really hard. So we want our companies to know that our money is unconditional in a sense. And like we don't, like, you're working with a really naive angel investor if they're paranoid about whether or not you're going to succeed and tracking everything you do and asking for updates, because it shows that they don't know the game. The game is a lot of things fail. So you have to be cool with that. You just have to trust there's always the process and then there's always the outcome. As with a lot of things, you can have a really great process and have bad outcomes. You can also have a bad process and have a good outcome. Some idiot who's like, oh, fuck, I'll throw money in this. It's great. So we have our process. We do try to connect the outcomes to the process, but it's not always going to be easy to do. It takes time. But I think when we make our investments, we're happy that we've done our homework, and hopefully the founders we work with are just great people that we joined this partnership, and it's going to be really hard. So those aren't tough to deal with, unless something goes sideways. I've seen a lot of shit. I've seen brothers and sisters come to blows. I've seen friendships destroyed. It's just not the best sometimes. And failure is important to learn, but it can be really hard on people too. I don't want to make it sound like failure's easy. Okay, so yeah, we do learn some things from the companies that don't work out, and that can be hard. The bad news comes first in a fund too. It's like the companies that aren't doing well are going to not do well sooner than the ones that are going to make it. So it's like you get all this bad news and you're like, oh shit, are things gonna work out? So that could be hard. But I think as long as, all right, then there's that anxiety. Is like, okay, but are one or a few of these companies gonna do well? That's where the pressure starts to kick in. Beyond that, a lot of investors fail because they didn't make the investment that they should have. So it's like they just passed on a great opportunity. And I keep track of the companies that I've met in that we took pitches from and so on, and that we passed on. And there have been some companies that have done extraordinarily well. I mean, I helped launch Ethereum, but I didn't buy a single one. That was the worst financial decision of my life. I have a Facebook post where I'm like announcing to the world that Ethereum is going on sale and everyone should buy one. Now, I was an officer at a nonprofit, so there's this issue where shouldn't benefit from the grantee, but I had a buddy who bought $1,000 worth and it was worth like $4 million a couple years ago, whatever. It's crazy. So that was probably the worst financial decision in my life. But then with the fund, we've passed on a few companies. One was a driverless. They were doing driverless golf carts for corporate campuses, but they eventually switched to trucking, and then they did quite well. They went public. There was a company, Relativity Space. They're one of these. They haven't launched their first rocket. I think it could be. It was supposed to be scheduled for last month, but they're valued over $1 billion. So there are these companies where we missed them, and we have to go back and think about, oh yeah, what was in that pitch, or what did we not see that we should have. And sometimes you can't blame yourself, but sometimes you're like, oh shoot, I have to change the way I do things. For us, the biggest thing might be Y Combinator. That's the biggest mixed signal, because I've just noticed over the years, as the batch sizes have gotten larger, that they've just forced canned material onto all the companies. And demo day will come along, we'll get 3 or 4 companies will reach out to us to schedule pitch meetings, and then they all come in and it's the same pitch. And I ask them, who told you to say this? And it's like that movie Hot Fuzz with the people who are like brainwashed. They're like, the partners. Like, who told you that you could raise money at this value? The partners. It's just scary. And some of these companies I've mentioned that we missed, we passed on because they were YC companies that were raising at some ridiculous valuation cap, and we passed for like, this is nuts. So, maybe I should be nicer about Y Combinator. But I think my criticism of them still holds, which is like, I think people should do the program. It's a great way to get some money. It's a great forcing function to get you working towards a goal. So you have this deadline you're trying to hit, and it can get you access to investors. That's very valuable. What I worry about is the advice that they give companies. They have this theory that in any one of their batches, one of those companies is $1 billion company, and the advice they give is geared to that one company. And if you're not that company, the advice that they give you can be catastrophic. So it could be like you raise at this high valuation, but then you don't grow into it. But you might have been able to if it was a $5 million valuation, but 25? Well, are you going to make the revenue in time to make the Series A? It's tough. And I think that doesn't serve those founders well. So that's my criticism of them. Okay, is that it? All right. I guess I'll say feel free to reach out to me. I'm Michael at 1517fund.com or at William_Blake on Twitter, William Blake the poet. You can just DM me there or email me. Or just contact us on our website. We have a contact form we check out. Thank you so much.
I wanted to give you all one final gift. So we have these things. Graduation cords, free if you're graduating, $5 each if you bought that. So I wanted to give you guys these gifts. Thank you guys.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thanks. Thank you, George.
Thanks, Mike. One last thing I'll say to everyone. I highly recommend Mike's book. I don't usually read like the physical books. I don't know what you think of that, Mike, but I did listen to it on Audible. So.
Yeah, Audible, Amazon.
I do this thing where I try to get CEOs, almost like trading cards.
Sure. zero to one.
And he talks a lot about like contrary to truths.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you have like you personally have like a similar strategy
Yeah.
on like what a good idea is, or even if that's like a
In
starter.
the fellowship, we would ask